Welcome to the International Insurance Society's Leadership Perspectives, the Global Pandemic. I'm Mike Morrissey, President and Chief Executive of the IIS, and today we present the seventh in our series of webinars on the many aspects of the coronavirus's impact on the insurance industry. Today I'm delighted to present a team of high-level experts from Reinsurance Group of America. RGA, as it's known throughout the industry, is a global leader in life reinsurance. RGA's reputation for thought leadership is supported by deep research into the issues that affect the industry, like the work they will share with us today. Representing RGA today are Dr. Daniel Zimmerman, Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Director, Julianne Callaway, Vice President and Actuary in Strategic Research, and Tim Roser, Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff to the CEO. Their presentation is titled The COVID-19 Pandemic, Insights and Implications for Insurers. We'll have time for questions from our attendees after their presentation, so please submit your questions online. Without further ado, Dan, would you please start us off by sharing RGA's research?
Great. Well, thank you, Mike. And I wish to welcome you all to this webinar. First and foremost, I hope you and your loved ones are all healthy and well and safe. Second, I just want to take a moment to mention and to reflect how proud I am, and I hope all of you are as well, to be working in an industry in which we are truly essential and vital to our clients' needs. We provide support and a financial safety net during times of need, and that is surely now. With that, I'd like to go over the outline for our agenda, and then we'll take it from there. So as you can see here, thanks, Mike, for the opening remarks. I'm going to be presenting the medical viewpoint. I'll then be passing it on to Julianne Callaway, who's going to address various perspectives and aspects of research. And then finally, Tim Roser is going to be wrapping it up with a look to the future. Hopefully, in the end, we'll have some time for a few additional questions. So let's begin with the medical view. So we're going to start with a polling question. So I'm going to turn it over. So go ahead and read the question, and I'll highlight it for you. So what will it take to bring an end to the COVID-19 pandemic? Maintenance of social distancing, an effective vaccine, a revolutionary new treatment, herd immunity, or time? It just needs to burn out. So please go ahead and vote. All right, so at this point, the results indicate that 71% of you feel an effective vaccine is what is needed. That is followed by herd immunity at 14%. Followed by time, 7%, and then a new treatment and maintenance of social distancing are 4%. So great, thank you. We had 807 responses, so very impressive there. So during the course of my talk today, I'm really going to be able to address this question. And the issue is it's a bit of a trick question because there's not necessarily one right answer. I think in some form or another, it's going to require all of these factors taking place. Certainly, I think some may weigh more heavily, but in certain cases, I think they're all going to be of value. So what I'm going to be looking at is the epidemiology and trends. It's going to be a fairly high-level report on that. We'll look at some of the prevention methods that are being employed, and I will be talking about the status of vaccines at that point. We'll look at clinical manifestations, but not in the classic sense. So I'll describe that further when I get there. We'll look at the new treatment modalities that are coming online. Certainly there are some that appear to be working and others that do not. So we'll dive into that. And then I think really almost the most important part is the issue of recovery and the development of immunity. So let's first talk a little bit about the epidemiology and trends. And the first thing I want to do is just to discuss the terminology. It can be a bit confusing. I think by far and away you hear the term COVID-19 used most commonly. However, there also is the term SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 is the actual name of the virus. It was named as such because it's a coronavirus and it's related to the first coronavirus, SARS, that we experienced in the early 2000s. The disease that it causes and the syndrome that it causes is called COVID-19. So that's the subtle difference. Next, I'd like to move over to the diagram on the right, and you see 4 different quadrants there. And these are really some highlights of how I want to describe and discuss the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the first part here is the 12 to 18 month time frame. I know a lot of people are quite happy with the fact that we're seeing peaks and now decreasing numbers of cases in many countries around the world, and I think that's wonderful. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that everywhere. We're still seeing increases, for example, in Africa and South America and some other regions. But the bottom line is we are in this for the long term. This is not going away anytime soon. And I think as insurers, we need to be planning well through 2021 for impacts that this may be having on our business. With regard to seasonality, what does that mean? Seasonality is the normal variation that we see, for example, in the typical influenza virus that comes and goes every year. It cycles. So during the northern hemisphere winter, it is at a peak, and then it naturally goes away during the summertime, only to recur the following fall. However, we now believe and think that with the coronavirus that we are not going to see seasonality, that it may not likely pass on its own during the northern hemisphere summer. Thus, this has implications for needs of potentially continuing social distancing right through the end of the year into next year. Now I'm going to jump across diagonally to a second wave. We're hearing a lot of discussion about a second and or third wave occurring. Historically, this has occurred with essentially every prior pandemic. So there is no reason to think this would not occur. There are really 2 main determinants of that. One is the characteristics of the virus itself, whether it is able to sustain itself and then continue circulating into the fall. And 2, I think, is also human behavior. How are we going to interact? What impact will social distancing have? And last, I want to mention herd immunity and why that is so important. So essentially, by definition, herd immunity means the number or percentage of the population that needs to be immune to an infection in order to prevent sustained transmission. For COVID-19, that has been calculated to be about 70%. Unfortunately, even though despite all the transmission that has gone on to this point, we are likely in the general population only in the single digits when it comes to prevalence of exposure. Thus, how are we going to get to 70%? 2 main ways. One is through continued natural infection, and 2 is hopefully through the expeditious development of a vaccine, and we'll talk more about that. As far as just the impact of social distancing, we all live it right now. We are a part of it at different stages. I just want to point out we're watching the strategy in Sweden, which is quite different. They have not locked down to the extent that other European countries have. They're experiencing a higher ICU rate, a higher mortality rate, but it might be another model that we can look at moving forward. And certainly we need to watch very carefully now the outcome of opening up strategies. We're seeing and talking much more about testing and contact tracing. We're hearing terms such as suppress and lift, which means that you suppress when the cases start to go up, you lift restrictions when they start to go down. That cycle may need to be repeated many times. We're hearing a lot about technologies being employed, such as mobile phone applications and the way that data can be collected from mobile phone users to look at how people are interacting and to also use that for contact tracing. So again, lots of technology that hopefully will help us epidemiologically. Let's talk a little bit about prevention, and I'm not going to talk too much about masks and face coverings, other than we've really seen quite a transformation over the last few months. Initially, a lot of the science indicated that typical surgical masks were not that protective. However, that still seems to be the case scientifically, but I think we've all seen quite a change indicating that lots of places now require people going out and wearing face masks or face coverings. They perhaps do provide some level of protection, and in fact probably are more important for the asymptomatic person to spread the virus to other individuals. Not going to spend more time on social distancing, but really it does appear to be effective in the areas that it has been used. I want to mention the Bcg vaccine. You may or may not have heard about this, but this is the vaccine that's 100 years old and is for tuberculosis. Interestingly, in countries that still use this vaccine, it has been observed that there appears to be a lower incidence of COVID-19 infections, and in those people who actually get COVID-19, their disease doesn't seem to be as bad. Now, this is very unusual to think, why would a vaccine for another disease impact something like COVID-19, for which it was not designed? The belief is that the Bcg vaccine essentially revs up the immune system and makes people to be able to fight off the infection better. So there is research going on in that area right now as we speak. A main point of this slide really is to update you all on the vaccine development. And this is truly a fascinating area to watch right now. You may have heard, again, that same timeline that we may not see an effective vaccine for the next 12 to 18 months. That still remains true. We do hear some reports that possibly by September we might see some being rolled out. I think that still might be a bit aggressive. But let's just go through some of these dot points here and really learn a little bit more what's going on with regard to vaccines. So first of all, there's been a lot of leveraging of prior research. Remember, there have been other coronaviruses. There was the first SARS virus. There's the MERS virus. So that information and research is being leveraged to develop COVID-19 virus vaccines. We're trying to accelerate the timeline. Now, a lot of this is fixed because you've got to do certain things like safety trials, you've got to do effectiveness trials, and then of course you've got to go into production. But there is so much collaboration going on right now that we really are hopeful that this is going to accelerate the development of vaccines. I do want to point out here the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. I won't go into it a lot, but it really is. It's an international organization, lots of collaboration between philanthropists, governments. There's a lot of money that is going into organizing and supporting research into vaccine development. The science of the vaccines and the candidate vaccines, you see there's a little asterisk there. There are all sorts of new technologies being employed into developing vaccines. Historically, most vaccines were composed of either a killed organism or a weakened organism that was then injected into the person to elicit the immune response. However, we're seeing all sorts of ones. For example, nucleic acid, so genetic technologies, other protein-based approaches. So it's all fascinating to watch how this is being developed. At this point, I believe there's somewhere over 90 different vaccines being worked on. So hopefully, at least several of those will be successful. Again, we've got to look at safety and efficacy. We've got to look at the long-term protection. I'll talk about that when I'm speaking about immunity coming up. It does no good to create a vaccine which maybe only makes someone immune for a few months, so we've got to think about that. We've got to worry about older individuals. Remember, they're the most susceptible, and they often don't respond to vaccines the way that younger people do, so we have to keep that in mind. Certainly the mass production issue is that we have to be able to commercially produce vaccines on the scale and on the time span that makes it viable so that we can actually achieve that herd immunity. And then last, the issue of acceptance of the vaccine by people. You may be aware that there's quite a significant anti-vaccination movement going on around the world. I am concerned that if a large number of people refuse to take this vaccine, that could then impede our achievement of herd immunity. A little bit about clinical manifestations. Now, what I'm not going to talk about here are the classical signs and symptoms of COVID-19 that I think we're all quite familiar with. So, for example, the shortness of breath, the fever, and the symptoms of fatigue. What I'm going to focus on are the risk factors for developing severe disease, and then we're going to look at a list of unexpected consequences, because these are all then going to have an impact on insurance. So from the risk factor point of view, we are very aware of age as being an older individual sign of risk. If you look over here to the graph on the right, you will certainly see that the rate of hospitalization significantly increases with age. I'm not going to be discussing mortality specifically, but we certainly know that the case fatality rate increases proportionally with age as well. People in nursing home or long-term care facilities, these are unfortunately very disproportionately affected by this pandemic. One, because they tend to be older individuals, and two, because they often have many chronic comorbid conditions, which are listed here as well, that put them at a significant increased risk. So, and simply living in a communal type of situation like a nursing home means that transmission can occur much more easily. I'd like to draw your attention to obesity, and we often don't hear about this as part of the risk factor for severe disease. But as the pandemic has been spreading more in the United States, we are seeing significant correlation between BMI greater than 30 and serious disease. And interestingly, this is correlated more in the under age 60 group. So we'll need to watch that very carefully. The unexpected consequences. Now this is something that's really quite new. We're seeing individuals with COVID-19 experience kidney failure requiring dialysis, all sorts of cardiac complications, including cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle becomes weakened. We see that the actual heart muscle itself seems to be able to be almost infected by the virus and damaged. We're seeing something akin to a heart attack-like syndrome that may be a triggering of various unstable plaque and or actually a different mechanism of heart attacks. We also are seeing neurological symptoms and stroke, and this has been noted even in younger people. And then this phenomenon of abnormal clotting of the blood, very unusual. There are maybe some physiological reasons why this is occurring, and that is something, though, we're going to have to investigate further. There are cases of liver damage, as well as children with an emergent inflammatory condition. And they also have something related to Kawasaki disease. Let's talk a little bit about treatment. There is so much going on and developing in this area. The first one I want to mention is remdesivir. This is one that I think is really getting some legs and is showing some signs of promise. Again, the convalescent plasma, this is from people who have recovered from the disease and are now donating their plasma in order to determine if that indeed can be used therapeutically. Other antivirals, such as the ones used for HIV and AIDS, are also being studied. I do want to use caution, though, because never have I seen so much medical literature released that is not peer-reviewed. So we have to be very careful about the data that we are looking at, because it does not always necessarily stand up to true science. So again, something we just need to be very aware of. Down at the bottom in the red area, I want to point out something that I'm really finding fascinating. And this is some of the new technologies that are being employed to determine if there are pre-existing medications, literally already on the shelf, that might be able to be used to treat COVID-19. And what we're seeing here is that they're actually cloning the virus, being able to then insert these proteins into human cells to determine how they interact. And then through computer algorithms, you can look for pre-existing medications that might be able to interfere with that process. So it's truly, truly fascinating. Now, the last part that I'm really excited here to point out to you about is the Longer Life Foundation. So RGA collaborates with Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine on a research foundation specifically dedicated to looking at the morbidity and mortality determinants that can be studied through research. This foundation now is 22 years old, and it's just cutting edge. We have former grant recipients right now who are actually working on COVID-19 research, so we're very proud of them. If you're interested, please check out our website, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and certainly if you're interested to learn about it or even participate, please feel free to contact me after this presentation. And last, I just want to wind up a little bit talking about recovery and immunity, as this is extremely important and it's an extremely complex issue. Unfortunately, at this point, we have more questions than answers. So I'm going to work through the questions, but hopefully provide some guideline around that as well. So what is the correlation between the resolution of symptoms and length of viral shedding? Well, we do know that after someone recovers from COVID-19, we can still detect by the PCR test the presence of the virus. Some people up to 6 weeks later. However, we don't think that that is necessarily correlating with them being infectious. But we are going to have to figure out how long someone truly is infectious after their acute infection. Now, could there be long-term health consequences for those who recover? I just mentioned all of those body systems that are impacted, the liver, the heart, the kidneys. And the question really is going to be, will those individuals have residual effects that will then impact their health and wellness later in life? Certainly it's going to be relevant from an insurance point of view, because from the business on the books point of view, those could potentially result in claims, and or from an underwriting point of view for new business, we'll have to understand what those risks are. The big question right now is, are the antibodies that we produce after the infection going to be protective? Will they prevent us from being reinfected? Because we know there are some people right now who can get infected with COVID-19 and they don't develop a high level of antibody. Could they be at risk? So that is something we're entirely going to study further. There was just an article in JAMA yesterday which was outlining this and how we're going to be able to move forward to learn more about this. And you're hearing a lot about antibody tests now coming out on the market. So these are of varying quality, and their sensitivities and specificities vary significantly. So we're going to have to understand the limitations of these tests in order to understand what the results really mean. Because, as my last question there points out, is it possible to issue immunity certificates? This would be, for example, if someone tests positive on the antibody, indicating hopefully that they are immune, they would actually have some sort of documentation in order to be able to provide and prove that they are indeed immune. So we're not there yet. We will find out where that goes moving forward. So really, to answer my question that you answered earlier, I think all of those really could be correct. As far as, what will it take? I don't think one of those is necessarily more important. I do think an effective vaccine is critical, but the others are all very important as well. So with that, I thank you, and excuse me about my voice there for a little bit. It seems to have come back, but at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Julianne Callaway. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. It's always very interesting, and we have a lot of commonality here. The first thing I want to talk about is the challenges in studying COVID-19. You ended your presentation talking about these outstanding questions. And this is an evolving topic, an evolving area of study. Really, some of the biggest challenges that we have when we're trying to understand the data is that there's really two big things. One is that the procedures are changing. And so some of the experience that we're getting in the data could be a reflection of the changing procedures rather than an actual change in the experience, as well as differences in reporting. So a lot of these differences in reporting pose challenges as we try and compare the experience from one place to another place. Specifically, there could be a significant amount of undercounting of the deaths that are reported as being COVID related. So for example, if one place counts a death only if it occurs in a hospital, then they might be missing a significant amount of COVID related deaths that are occurring, say, in the home or in a care facility. And this impacts how we analyze the data as we go from that comes from one place to another. An additional challenge that we face are the changes in government restrictions. So as the government says that, we should be staying at home and social distancing, and then they begin to lift those recommendations, then every time they make a change, it has a very big impact on the experience. And then likewise, that shows up in the experience in the projection models that come from experts. So this is an evolving area that's very challenging. And so then what we wanted to understand is how the audience feels about these challenges. So that brings us to our next polling question. So what are the biggest challenges that you face when you try and understand the impact of COVID-19 on your business? Do you find that there's a limited availability of data? Do you find it challenging to sift through all the reports and analyses that are coming your way? Do you have a hard time making sense of the information that's coming your way because it's changing or sometimes even conflicting? Are you having trouble understanding the differences between what you see that's going on in the population versus your own insured experience? Or is it all of the above? I'm seeing the responses coming in, and as they're coming in, I would say that by and large, they are lining up with my expectation, which as I put together this polling question, these were all challenges that we face, and it's kind of hard to pick which one I think is most important. And so if I were answering this, I would say all of the above, and the vast majority of you are saying that as it's coming in. The changing and conflicting evidence is showing up as the number 2, and limited availability is number 3. And I'd say by and large that meets my expectations as well. I think we can close this poll and move on. So what do we do with that? There's all these challenges, but the way we've responded to this is a twofold approach. The first is we take all of the expertise, all of the knowledge that we have in our team, and we marry that with as much information as possible. So we have a very multidisciplinary team that has deep expertise in scientific knowledge, as well as very technical capabilities to perform advanced analytics. And then as well as actuarial expertise that then can these insights and apply it to our business. But in order to make well-informed decisions, we need to be basing that off of data, which comes from a variety of sources. That includes government data, academic data, as well as a review of scientific literature. The challenge is that the data comes in fast and furious. It's almost information overload, and it's very hard to discern what is a credible and reliable source, which is why we rely heavily on our scientific experts to point us to what is a credible and reliable source of information, as well as understanding the scientific literature that is often conflicting, and it changes over time as more information unfolds. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways I would like as we proceed into our analysis, is that this is an evolving area, that we are presenting data from the most reliable sources that we know of right now, but it's an area of ongoing study. And so it's something, it makes this a challenge, but it also is an opportunity to learn more. So I'd like you to take you through some of the research findings that we've been studying. We wanted to understand how age impacts COVID-19 mortality experience. And so in order to do this investigation, first of all, we had to compile a reliable source of information that could allow for this comparison. And this was really a very, very challenging undertaking that required finding data from a variety of sources. And these data generally came from government sources that a lot of times was not in the same language and was most certainly not in the same format. And it took our scientists and our data analysts a lot of work to put them together in an aggregated data set. At the end of my presentation, we provide all of the data sources for you if you want to go back and take a look and see where that data was sourced. But when we put it all together, it was very clear that COVID-19 experience is related to age, and that that the experience for those who are over age 60 is significantly worse than those who are under age 60. And it's interesting to note that this is not what has happened in previous respiratory pandemics. Most respiratory pandemics, the shape of the mortality curve is more U-shaped, meaning that the people that are the youngest and the oldest within the population have the worst experience. And this is different than what happened for the 1918 Spanish flu, which that mortality curve was more of a W shape, where the people that were the youngest, the oldest, and as well the working age adult population had the worst experience. But for COVID-19, it's really the elderly that are most impacted and have the worst experience if they become infected. We also looked at experience based on gender. Now, here we show gender mortality ratios, and a gender mortality ratio is male mortality rate divided by the female mortality rate. And if you have a gender mortality ratio that is above 1, that indicates that males are having worse mortality experience than females. Now, males in general have worse mortality experience than females, and that's shown in the red in the all-cause mortality. COVID-19 experience that we found is also worse for men, and the difference is more pronounced. And so there's a few explanations for this. It's possible that men are not living as healthy of a lifestyle. It's possible that there is a difference in behavioral aspects. So, for example, if women are more likely to adhere to government recommendations about social distancing, or maybe they are better about recommendations to wash their hands, that could be having an impact on it. There could be a difference in the immunity that women have that makes them more able to combat a virus. And so there's what we're seeing is that there is an impact or a difference in the response and the outcomes for women relative to men. We're trying to understand why, but that's going to come, I think, probably with time. We also see that when we look at the difference in experience based on age, this chart shows the experience for those who are over age 60. And the gender mortality ratios are highest and most pronounced for those who are in the 60 to 69-year-old age group. And as the gender mortality ratios begin to converge about age 80 plus. Which is interesting there is that gender mortality ratios tend to converge at younger ages than that for all-cause related mortality. Part of the difference by age and part of the difference in experience by age may be in part due to the prevalence of chronic conditions. So we know that older people have a higher rate of chronic conditions, which might be part of the explanation why there's such a difference in experience by age. And this chart here shows that most of the people who are hospitalized for COVID-19 in the U.S. have a comorbid condition. In fact, 90% of hospitalizations for COVID have a comorbidity in the U.S. And early evidence has shown that there's an increase in mortality experience in Italy and China for people with chronic conditions. But as we've had time to assess the situation, there's been unfolding literature that has come out that has questioned how much of an impact these chronic conditions are actually having on outcome when you control for other factors, and that really maybe some of these chronic conditions have a larger role to play than others. So I would say that chronic conditions are an evolving area of study and one that we're going to continue to follow. So where do we go with all of this when there's so much changing data and a lot of it is incomplete and very hard to compare from one place to another? I think one of the things that we can do is to study special cases. So one example of a special case is the Diamond Princess. The Diamond Princess is a cruise ship, and the reason why this is a special case, it's of interest to insurers and to us, is because every passenger that was on this cruise ship was tested, and all of the outcomes are known. And so by studying this population, you can understand a little bit of the experience without having to weed through the unknowns. So what we know from this population is that half of the people that tested positive for COVID-19 at the time of the test were asymptomatic. And the people who passed away as a result of COVID-19 were all over age 60, and the vast majority of them had underlying health consequences or underlying health conditions. Now, the challenges in studying COVID-19 are great, and the way we move forward is with a multidisciplinary approach to our research by including scientists, actuaries, and data scientists, using the most advanced information that's possible and studying the medical literature. So with that, I would like to pass this off to Tim so he can take us into the future, see what's coming up next.
All right, thanks, Julianne. So Dan and Julianne, I guess, have kind of given us some background on how we got here and what we know so far. What I'm going to try to do is take a look into the future, where we might be when we look back on this in, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. So I am an actuary by background, so that means I do tend to look to the past to try to predict the future. And I guess in one sense, fortunately, there's not a whole lot of data points to look at with respect to pandemics because, it's an infrequent event. Now, unfortunately, from an actuarial perspective, that makes it difficult to extrapolate from past data. The other thing that's difficult is that every pandemic we do have is quite unique. The pathogens themselves are unique in terms of their transmission rates and their mutations and the ultimate case mortality. And also our response to those pandemics is also unique. It's unique to the circumstances of the time and the place in which they occur. If we go all the way back to the 1300s and look at the Black Death pandemic, which was a bubonic plague outbreak, it was devastating. Over 50% of the European population passed away. Now today, there still are cases of bubonic plague, even here in the U.S., but that same pathogen doesn't have the same impact because of antibiotics. Julianne talked a little bit about the 1918 influenza, which is also very unique. Unique in that W curve that she discussed, where it attacked the people in their 20s through their 40s. Also unique in terms of it was disproportionately affected some parts of the globe versus others. India had about a 6% death rate in their total population, whereas other parts of the globe were impacted less. Now, if we think about today, kind of fast forward to today, if you had asked me a year ago, right, I may have said, well, today we have global surveillance systems and we have all these advanced technologies and therapeutic treatments. It's hard to imagine such a scenario unfolding today, and yet here we are, right? We're in the middle of a devastating, global pandemic. Part of the reason, obviously, is global travel. Once something pops up in one part of the world, it's very hard to, contain it. And also maybe we got a little complacent or a little overconfident as a society. Regardless, we're not complacent or overconfident now. This is, time to deal with the situation at hand. So each of these past, pandemics is unique, but they do have some common characteristics. I'm going to broadly group those into three categories, medical, behavioral, and financial. These three determinants form a Venn diagram. And the intersection of that Venn diagram is really the impact that it'll have on society and the impact that it'll have on the insurance industry. And it's also important to note that these three are really interconnected and interdependent. The medical impacts the behaviors impact the financial, and so forth. So if we look at this a little bit more detail, Dan and Julianne talked a lot about the characteristics of the disease having an impact. What's the attack rate? What's the case fatality rate? How does it vary from one gender to another, et cetera? And also the infrastructure that we have in healthcare delivery. Can we identify cases early? Can we develop and scale therapeutics or vaccines? But I also want to talk about sort of some of these secondary or tertiary effects, or ripple effects, if you will. These aren't directly related to the disease, but they could be indirectly related either to the disease or to our response to the disease. There's lots of examples of these types of things. One, for example, would be motor vehicle mortality. There's a lot of speculation early on, myself included in this pandemic, thinking that, motor vehicle mortality will have a big reduction because people will be at home, they won't be driving as much, et cetera. And as we look at the emerging data, there is evidence, of course, that traffic is way down, that accidents by count are down, but it's not necessarily translating to a reduction in mortality. Now, the data is still early and this is still anecdotal, but there's some areas actually that are reporting elevated fatalities due to people driving faster because the roads are empty. It's anecdotal at this point, and it's just one cause of death, but it's a good reminder that we're dealing with complex adaptive systems that are really interdependent, and it's hard to sometimes predict with any degree of certainty what the outcome might be. I'm looking at behavioral. I'll have a lot more on this in the next slide. Clearly, this is a key determinant, both in the short term in terms of the progression of the disease, as well as longer term in terms of what's the consequences on public health and on the economy. One of the big behaviors we've obviously had so far are the mitigation efforts of governments trying to slow the spread of the disease, which of course has follow-on impacts not only on the disease but also on the economy. For the insurance industry specifically, our primary focus is on adverse selection. So behaviors or actions that individuals take that change the risk profile of a block of business in aggregate relative to what we might have originally expected. And that can be exacerbated by the actions and behaviors of intermediaries. And then finally, financial implications, or the financial determinants, are also profound in terms of their impact. The financial strength of a country or a company has an impact on how they're able to respond to the pandemic. And then in turn, the response has an influence on the medical outcomes, but also on the financial strength of the company or the country. So again, a lot of interdependence in these factors. In the time I have left, I'm going to take a look at each of these in turn and try to determine how they might impact the future of the insurance industry. But first, I think we have our final polling question. We can go to open that up. And what we're asking here is, which of these three broad categories, medical, behavioral, or financial, do you think will have the biggest ultimate impact on the insurance industry? So lock in your votes. This is your last chance to vote today. So it is looking like a slight majority of you are choosing financial, followed by behavioral, and then, interestingly, medical, bringing up the rear. Give just a couple more seconds, and then go ahead and close the poll, and you can probably see the results in the closed poll section. So about 52% of you saying the financial impacts on balance sheets and so forth of the financial industry. We'll talk a little bit about that, followed by behavioral and medical. So let's dig into these a little bit more detail in terms of their long-term impact on the insurance industry. Starting with medical, Dan did talk about what sort of lingering effects there might be on COVID-19 survivors, and we'll be looking at this very closely. Are there ongoing effects, pulmonary effects or neurologic effects or cardiac effects that last beyond the period of infection? But even if there aren't, we'll be studying the impact on mortality improvement very closely. In short term, one of the big questions that we have is, to what extent are some of the deaths that are occurring during this pandemic, quote unquote, accelerated? Again, purely in terms of actuarial probabilities. We know that these people, as Julianne was talking about, tend to be more advanced age, more likely to have severe health conditions or comorbidities. So if some of those deaths would have been expected to occur over the shorter medium term in the actuarial tables, might that accelerate some of the death, followed by a short-term pop in mortality improvement, maybe even a middle-term or longer-term pop in mortality improvement at the older ages. This is consistent with what we saw after 1918, a pop in mortality improvement. Longer term, though, I always think about mortality improvement on a cause-by-cause basis. Each cause of death has different drivers that impact its longer-term mortality improvement. Now, hopefully, some of these causes are going to benefit from all of the medical research that we've been investing in with respect to COVID-19. When we look at some of the work that's been underway for years on a universal flu vaccine or on cancer vaccines, perhaps some of this research will accelerate those efforts. But I guess it could also go the other way. There could be some crowding out as research funding goes explicitly towards COVID-19 instead of some other causes of death. I think we'll have to wait and see. And there's another interrelated here between medical and behavioral. On the behavioral side, we are seeing some evidence of hospital avoidance with emergency department visits down for strokes and heart attacks and other causes of disease. That doesn't mean that those things aren't happening, but if people aren't getting treated for them, that could have some residual impact on mortality improvement. But there's also some positives, right? We're seeing more telemedicine, which could be safer and also attract people that might not otherwise go to the hospital or go to the doctor. We're seeing some of these hygiene benefits that Julianne was talking about, hand washing and mask wearing and working from home. So I think it's kind of a balance, but it will have an impact over the longer term. Now, specific to the insurance industry, I'll talk just a little bit about risk assessment. And there's been kind of an ongoing reckoning for a long period of time here. Kind of on one hand, you've got the accelerated fluidless camp, and on the other hand, you have kind of the full underwriting camp. It's obviously a continuum in between. I think during the pandemic, there's certainly been more push towards accelerated and fluidless options because it's been difficult to get lab testing done, and face-to-face collection of specimens and so forth is difficult. That's probably led to some concessions that might be difficult to roll back later on. But then on the other hand, if nothing has heightened the importance of comorbidities on all-cause mortality, like this pandemic. So, perhaps we'll see some, some pressures to, strengthen the risk assessment process. So next we have the behavioral influences. Now, if I was personally voting in the last poll, I probably would have selected behavioral influences because I think those, regardless, they will certainly have a big impact long-term for insurers. First of all, we look at the demand side. From the consumer perspective, nothing should reinforce the value prop of insurance more than a pandemic. But it's actually interesting because the data, at least the early data, is a bit mixed. We saw an early uptick in search activity and application activity, but suggesting that might be short-lived, kind of an early pop. So we'll have to track to see what the long-term impact is on demand. There's also been an ongoing shift towards online channels over a longer period of time, not just direct-to-consumer, but also tech-enabled traditional advisor sales. And I think that combination of both direct-to-consumer as well as advisor sales with technology-enabled will continue, and maybe has been accelerated throughout this pandemic. And at the company level, perhaps there'll be a reassessment of individual risk appetites, which could change people's perspective on risk transfer or reinsurance. The most important thing in my part of this presentation as an actuary really is about adverse selection and about fraud. Any time we have a disruption in the status quo, we have the risk that past experience might deviate substantially from what we see in the future. And then when we layer on desperate financial circumstances, that could also accelerate the risk of fraud. And both of these, anti-selection and fraud, can be more difficult to identify, during a pandemic because of reduced access to evidence and risk selection, et cetera. It could show up at the time of purchase if people that have higher exposure decide to load up on coverage with the anticipation of just lapsing once the pandemic has passed. It could also show up in in-force business as people exercise the optionality in their policies, whether it be withdrawals or policy loan provisions or conversions or purchase options. These are perfectly appropriate, but in mass, it could have an impact on expected utilization relative to pricing in an adverse way. We also look at the behaviors of governments and of industry regulators and rating agencies. Again, completely understandable behaviors. They want to protect consumer rights. They want to ensure the solvency of the industry. But these actions will come with some additional costs down the road for the industry. And then I think no discussion on behaviors is complete without talking about trust. How the industry responds during this pandemic is going to impact the trust that people have in the industry. And it's also going to impact how they might behave in the future. if people lose trust, that can take a long time to rebuild. Mark Carney has a quote that's often restated. He says, "Trust arrives on foot, but leaves in a Ferrari." It takes a long time to build, but it goes away very quickly. But this is an opportunity for the industry, to act ethically, to remain financially resilient, to deliver on our social responsibilities. I think there's a bright future if we can instill that long-term trust with stakeholders. So finally, let me talk briefly on the financial impacts. Certainly, there could be some impact on the industry's collective balance sheet with respect to capital levels or asset impairments. We saw that in the poll that this was selected as the highest potential impact. I also think from a strategic perspective, companies might use this as an opportunity to take a look at their product portfolios with a more critical strategic lens. Decide, okay, what areas do we really want to focus on as our competitive advantage? Maybe what lines of business might we want to divest? It also could have an impact on innovation efforts. There's been a lot of funding in the last little while on insurtech activities and other innovation type activities, and we'll have to see whether this stifles that investment or maybe raises the stakes and people double down on it. As far as broader macroeconomic consequences, very difficult to predict, but we're going to have to unwind at some point from all of these interventions that governments and central banks have made to stimulate the economy, and we'll have to see what impact that has longer term. And then finally, I guess the most direct financial burden of this crisis, unfortunately, are being borne by consumers. Right? We've seen a tragic rise in unemployment. As it relates to the insurance industry, that might relate or correlate to an increase in disability claims down the road, which tend to be correlated with economic cycles. We might also see a drop in purchase behavior, not because people don't want or need protection insurance, but because unfortunately they might have to see it as a luxury that they can't afford, at least over the next little while. So summing it all up, as we've all said, these are unprecedented times. There's a lots of unknowns as to how it might still unfold, but I do think this is an opportunity for the insurance industry, to reaffirm our social purpose, to provide financial resilience, to identify areas and places where we can innovate and better respond, to meet the needs of our consumers. Times like these are why the insurance industry exists. So, this is our time to shine. So with that, let me send it back to Mike. We have a couple of minutes, I think, left for some questions.
Well, thank you, Tim, Daniel, and Julianne for sharing information and insights that were not only individually valuable, but very complementary and comprehensive on the whole. We have gotten, not surprisingly, a number of questions. We can't possibly address them all. I've tried to aggregate, paraphrase, and synthesize some of the questions, and in the brief time we have remaining, we'll address what we can. Let me start, and whoever thinks it's appropriate to respond, please do so. With the 1918 Spanish flu, I think it was the second or even the third wave of the disease that were even more virulent than the first. And is this a risk with the COVID-19 as well?
So yeah, so as I mentioned, I think we are likely expecting a second and or potential third wave. The question will be, if it occurs, will it be worse or not? And that, I think, still is not known. Traditionally and historically, some of the second waves have been worse. Interestingly, it does depend on behavior to some extent. Interestingly, here in St. Louis, the first wave actually happened to be fairly mild because of social distancing. The population at that time then became more lax, and the second wave was more significant, whereas other cities in the U.S., it was the opposite. So I think from a planning point of view, we should anticipate that, as I mentioned, that 12 to 18 month time frame, and anticipate that we very well could see a second wave potentially in this October-November time frame later this year.
Yeah, the other thing I would add is 1918, that second wave was really exacerbated by secondary infections. So not just the influenza itself, but other things that maybe we would be in better position to treat today.
Well, that's an interesting comment, Tim, because it leads to another a cluster of questions I had. what are some of the other potential short and long-term effects of the pandemic that aren't directly related to the infection itself?
Yeah, I had a little hard time hearing that, but I think you're asking about indirect effects of COVID-19, and we're starting to see that more and more now. We've started, first of all, beginning to look at all-cause mortality being up year over year, not necessarily due to COVID-19 deaths. Now, there may be reasons behind that, because we're certainly not counting all the COVID-19 deaths, but other effects that we're seeing are that people are avoiding going to healthcare providers for general health care. So, for example, the vaccine rate in children is significantly decreased. We know that screening for cancer, for example, mammograms and colonoscopies, are reduced. And other more elective type therapies, but even some therapies for people with cancer, are postponed, at least temporarily. So those may certainly have some effect down the road. On the favorable side, I think you've seen some reports in certainly some cities where the air quality has significantly improved. Now, will that lead to an actual outright improvement in mortality in those areas? That's hard to know. But again, we try to balance as much as possible. And then last, I just read this, that the number of organ transplants has significantly decreased. There's data out of France and the US showing that this has occurred. So unfortunately, that will likely impact those individuals negatively.
Okay. This seems to be primarily a respiratory disease, but do you know why the virus seems to be affecting so many other body systems as well? Is that part of your research?
Yes, there's been a lot of work on that because, as I said, those are sort of unexpected consequences. And it has to do with the cell receptor that the virus attaches to and then invades the cell. So those are primarily located in the lung tissue, but they also occur in other organs, such as the inside of blood vessels. And thus, that is where we think maybe part of the trigger for the increased blood clotting. And also that inflammatory response leads to something we call a cytokine storm, or a cascade of events that unfortunately then lead to very detrimental outcomes.
Here's a much broader question, but I think an important one for the industry. There was a mention of a shift to more online purchasing because of people are staying home and so forth. We've heard before that there's going to be a surge in online purchasing, sort of a direct-to-consumer trend in the economy. That hasn't really blossomed yet. Do you think this is finally going to have a major development of online?
Yeah, I'll take that, and then Julianne, if you have anything to add as well. I've been in this industry for a long time, and I've been working in the last several years on the innovation side with digital distribution, and kind of seen a lot of new innovations come and go. It's been up and down, but I think there's a long-term trend towards more and more online, more and more instant direct-to-consumer or tech-enabled advisor sales. And I do think that this will accelerate those efforts. Whether it becomes the dominant distribution channel in the future, I think it's going to vary market by market and product by product, but certainly I think this is an accelerant. I don't know, Julianne, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I tend to think that this might be what pushes us over the edge to actually make a wave, a splash in this area. Certainly there's been a lot of activity leading up to this time, and I expect, first of all, that there's going to be a lot of behaviors, just like working behaviors, the way we just live our lives, that change, that have other impacts, and being more digital is certainly one of them. And I think a lot of the hesitancy that companies have had toward innovations might relax now, because they've had to relax in other ways, and now might be the time where we finally make a difference in digital sales of insurance.
That would have a huge impact on the industry. I had a couple of sharp-eyed observers from outside the U.S. who wondered why you didn't have the U.S. in your age and gender charts.
Yes. some really astute observation. I'd say that the data that was included in our charts had 3 criteria. One is that it needed to be a credible data source. 2, it needed to be relatively new. So we had to have data that was not too old. And we also had to have data that we analyzed by age, by gender, and we compared it to all-cause mortality. And to have all 3 of those be relatively current and available was really our main criteria for sourcing the data. In the U.S., the all-cause mortality experience, while available, it's lagged, and the reporting lag is very significant, and so it would maybe not be it's not ready to be included in the analysis just yet.
I understand. Well, we have a number of questions that we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to because we've just about run out of time after this very comprehensive presentation and good responses to the questions. At this point, I think I'll ask Tim if he has any brief closing remarks today.
Yeah, so obviously thanks everybody for attending the webinar. Appreciate your ongoing interest. Hope that what we had to say has added to the conversation. We're all in this together as an industry, so appreciate your feedback, appreciate your interest. As Mike said, there's a lot of questions we probably didn't get to. We're going to try to work with Mike and the IAS to collect those and see if we can respond back to you. If you have any questions, on the screen right now, you see a web page. You can click there and we'll do the best again to respond to anything that you ask us in a timely manner. Mike, I guess that's probably the end of it from our side.
Well, thank you, Tim, Dan, and Julianne. These insights have enormous bearing on our industry's future, not just in the short term in our quarantine phase, but for the longer term of our industry. And thanks especially to our attendees from around the world for their interest and their very active participation today. Please join us next week for a presentation next week by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners CEO, Mike Considine, on the regulatory response to COVID-19. The NAIC perspective on the pandemic is obviously very important and worthwhile to hear. So for today, this is Mike Morrissey saying goodbye on behalf of the IAS. Join us next time.